Okay, welcome back to Tech Leader Stage. Our next panel, Responsible AI in Practice, Real-World Examples and Challenges. Please welcome with me on stage WeAreDevelopers from AI Experts, Mina Zaitzi from Fairtech, Björn Brinkmann from Deloitte, and Stefan Basse from Business Insider.
Well, thank you, Louisa, for the introduction, and thank you all for coming for attending the panel. So we're going to be talking about responsible AI today and responsible AI in practice. And for that, I am joined by three wonderful experts that Louisa has already dropped the names of. We have Mina first, who I've known previously, and she is a wonderful data and AI expert. She's the founder of Inclusive Tech, her own startup lobby and consulting organization. And then we have Björn Brinkmann, who is currently managing director at Deloitte, and where he leads the AI Institute. And then we have Ray Eitel-Porter, who has been in the field just as Björn for a few decades, I would say, and who used to be lead AI at Accenture and is now still senior advisor to Accenture, but sort of a former executive AI expert. And one administrative thing, we would have time in the end for a Q&A. So if you have any questions that arise during the talk, feel free to post them in the app, and we will answer them, or our experts will answer them in the end. And I am Stefan, I'm journalist at Business Insider, but I am not the center of this talk today. So let's jump right in. The first question that we thought of would be important for today is that responsible AI has sort of become a buzzword increasingly in the last few years, I think. And that can make communication about it kind of hazy, because it's a little diluted, if you will. So to get the clarity back into it, maybe we can start with everyone sort of giving their definition, or trying to give a definition of what responsible AI means, and that we can find a common ground here on stage. Maybe, Ray, you can start.
By all means. Thank you, Stefan. So for me, the critical thing is that responsible AI is about implementing AI ethics and AI safety, and it also includes compliance with the law. So if you think about AI ethics, that would include defining principles and setting ethical norms. Typically, when we talk about responsible AI, we're focusing much more on the actual implementation of the program, which would also include then compliance with regulations and laws, which would be applicable to a particular business, and would include AI safety.
Do you agree with that definition, Björn?
I think I wouldn't disagree, certainly. I think what for me and us mostly responsible AI is that it should be human-centric, right? That we think human-centric about AI. And the other key piece, and that's what I kind of like about the responsible AI, it's not entirely clear, but it's a great conversation starter, so to speak. And that's what you want eventually, right? You want the people to talk about it and get everybody involved. And that, I think, works very well. And then you automatically get topics, obviously, like ethics and safety and so far in there. And then what exactly it means maybe doesn't need to be perfectly clear, right?
So strategic
but the conversation needs to happen, so that's, yeah.
Okay, conversation. So, Mina, do you agree with that?
I agree that it's a great conversation starter, because imagine I ask you, do you want to be responsible or trustworthy? You would immediately say yes, of course. And that's why trustworthy or responsible AI as a terminology works, because no company would ever say we don't care about it, because it could be damaging their image. And if you look at it from an ivory tower perspective, a group of researchers coming together, they will talk about AI ethics, and a room full of executives and developers within an organization would probably use the other terminology of responsible AI. And nonetheless, we see it's being used as a buzzword, and there's still a lack of clarity, because the research even is in children's shoes.
But is there sort of a way to sort the different words that we've sort of thrown around? We've thrown around transparency, fairness, we've thrown around AI ethics, and then also responsible AI. Is there sort of, do they just fly around if you're in practice and you're talking to clients, or is there sort of a way to make sense and categorize them as well?
AI ethics would be probably the umbrella term that holds everything together, where you deal with philosophical, legal, societal aspects of it. Meanwhile, trustworthy or responsible AI is the wording that is better for marketing or even selling your advisory or consulting services towards clients. Yeah.
So it's the marketing term then. Coming a bit to from the definition, I think we sort of have an impression now, at least, that we can build up on. To the state of affairs, like what is the state of responsible AI, especially in companies in practice? Mina, you already mentioned that you have criticized sort of the private sector before, so not caring enough about AI ethics. What would you say is the state of responsible AI in the private sector? Is there more attention to it?
AI ethics is viewed as a nice to have rather than a must have, more of a luxury topic, particularly in time of a macroeconomic recession. And we even see companies cutting down costs if it comes to diversity in technology and AI ethics, because the tech industry is always about being faster than the competition. What we observe in the race of generative AI, who releases the product feature earlier than another company, and hence questions on the societal implications are going more and more to the back room, and we need to change the narrative, although I'm quite hopeful, because as you mentioned earlier, Ray, we see a lot of regulatory and legal pressure coming from the European Commission with the EU AI Act worldwide, the first regulation on AI models, assessing them according to their risk, and also the corporate social responsibility, CSRD, Corporate Social Responsibility Directive. And with these laws, I'm hopeful that companies will be more accountable in the future.
Please.
So I completely agree with you, Mina, that the larger tech companies aren't necessarily prioritizing in the way that they should do. I am pleased, though, that when we talk with companies who are actually implementing AI, I think that responsible AI has risen much higher up the agenda over the last sort of 12 to 18 months. And I think that's been driven by two things. One is the regulatory pressure that's starting to build with the EU AI Act and so on, but also the press coverage of things like ChatGPT giving wrong answers, causing problems, and so on. And when companies want to adopt the technology, they're probably more cautious than the companies who are developing it, because they can't afford to have an incident which would negatively impact their brand and cause them to lose customer trust. So I think that's changed quite a lot over the last sort of 12 months.
Yeah, would absolutely agree. I think, let's say a couple of years back, maybe even a decade, like folks like you, basically, right? Data scientists have seen that you can do lots of things with the technology that maybe you shouldn't necessarily do, but it was more of a bottom-up approach, right? Like trying to tell, let's say, the decision makers, the executives, that maybe not everything that's possible should be done. Now with the EU AI Act, and I mean, it's becoming active or becoming implemented very soon, right? But it's been discussed already since, I don't know, forever it feels. We see that we're talking a lot more to C-levels, and it's not something that's delegated to, that's for the legal department to handle, right? It's really on the CEO desk every day. And obviously now it gets this kind of top-down approach as well, which makes it a lot easier to implement all these kind of things in the company. And hence this pressure, as you said, from the media, there's a pressure also from people, from the workers in the company, to do AI in a responsible way, and also to not do AI, right? I think there are many that thought, okay, that's complicated, let's just skip it. But then very quickly the market comes around and says, well, you can, but then you're not going to exist in 5 years anymore, right? So it's a lot of pressure, and that so far seems to turn into good results.
Björn, let me ask you, who in a C-level is responsible for it?
It's a very good question. Typically, you would say when it comes to regulatory topics, right, like the UA stuff, you would have the legal department or the compliance department. They're typically not the ones that are handling this one, because if you just regulate, then what you would often do is basically just shut everything down, right? You quickly get this like, oh, there's a risk, so we say no. Here you have to kind of balance this regulation and innovation. So it's really key to balance this, which means you can't just attach it to the legal department or the compliance department, because then one side would be too heavy. You also can't just give it to the tech department, then the other side would be too heavy. So you need to orchestrate, and we see typically that there's a small like task force or so built that's usually attached very high up, because you need the power to push in the whole organization. And then you have that workforce also defining and elaborating what that means for that particular company, because you don't want to have one individual having their opinion about AI in a company setup, right? You need to have principles for the company, how they see responsible AI, and those that need to be implemented. So that's why you need the task force, you need a balance to get the innovation, but to be obviously compliant. There's always a little bit of wiggle room, right? So you need to know when and if you go there. Quite often we see companies that start more heavy on the, let's say, more careful, so more looking at the whole regulatory topics, but not forgetting the innovation part. And then once they become more familiar with it, right, it kind of comes more into balance, or maybe the regulatory, I wouldn't say they ignore it, right, but they are comfortable with it, they know what they're doing, they see the boundaries, it's established, and then you can move into the innovative part quite easily.
Is that also one of the challenges you see? Because we want to sort of talk about responsible AI in practice, and like one of the questions I pose myself is like, what are the main challenges that companies come to consulting firms, for example, and what sort of hinders implementation that is now very much under pressure after the EU AI Act, as we already mentioned? Maybe we can stay with you for a second there.
Yeah, since you mentioned consulting companies, we love to think in 2x2s, right? So you have, it depends on who's coming, obviously, right? So you have companies which are very used to regulation. They tend to over-regulate. And then you have companies which are under the pressure that they're very disrupted by this technology. Let's say, I don't know, retail, for example, right? Or even more strongly, the whole media industry, right? Like pictures, images, text, sound, you can generate everything, and with that, basically 99% of what a media company does is in one way or the other disrupted. But they hardly have any experience with regulation. So they struggle with the regulatory part, and the other ones tend to struggle with the balance, basically, to kind of keep it, to not over-regulate it, to not just shut everything down. So that's typically where they seek, where they seek advice how to properly combine that. Yeah, but
I mean, I would completely agree with what you say, Bjorn. I think the other challenge that companies have is the practical implementation, because this point that you made very, very strongly about it being a cross-enterprise, challenge. You've got to have the technical people, the legal people, the business people. Everybody has to be on board, and then you have to make sure that the controls that you have do cover the whole of the company, and that includes areas like procurement if you're buying in third-party programs. So I typically see it taking companies at least 12 months and often 24 months to actually really design and implement a program across a large organization, with a lot of training and awareness building and so on that's required. And I think a lot of companies underestimate just how big a task it's going to be.
There's also a lot of financial resources then that go into it. And is that then hitting all companies with the same intensity and on the same level? Like, do they all struggle the same way, or are there also differences between larger and smaller organizations? Like, have you seen any experiences with that in the practice?
It heavily depends on the type of organization we are talking about. An enterprise organization has got the financial means to implement it, and as you explained, the governance structure to establish that is complex and requires personal and financial resources. One great example and forerunner on that topic is IBM, who established internally a so-called IBM AI Ethics Board, where you have an interdisciplinary approach and people representing different departments and domain expertise, and they discuss the technologies and use cases they're working on, and in case they don't agree with something to be considered as ethical according to their principles, they do not publish that technology to that market. And it's not only damaging for the employer brand, but also it has got a financial impact, particularly on the stock prices. If you are an enterprise listed in a stock market, investors will look into AI as a risk factor. And this is something important to keep in mind, which is why I'm optimistic that there will be more investments made towards responsible AI. If you're a small and medium-sized company, you might not have the full capacity to implement everything, but you could at least rethink your AI guidelines and consider ethical aspects to it. And this is also not a philosophical or social topic, but also how do you treat data protection? How important you view protecting sensitive information about your users and establishing the trust towards them and the public? And if you're a startup, of course, you're struggling to have enough money to develop such an expensive AI models considering the cloud computing costs. And there it might not be a high priority, which is completely fine, but should be thought of in a later stage of an investment round.
Is there sort of also some industries that struggle more than others? Because there's, I mean, the kinds of AI that we're talking about are very different, that sort of are being used and that you have to use responsibly. Like, is there between healthcare, between automotive, are there sort of differences and different problems and challenges the companies face with implementing it responsibly? Maybe starting with Björn.
Yeah, it's very, very similar to what I mentioned before, right? You have the companies that are kind of, and I'm only, like, we're not talking too much to startups, right? So the perspective you have, I can't really look into, but the big corporates, it's really the ones which are heavily disrupted, right? Is kind of one group, if you like, and the other group is really, that we see are different, are the ones which, let's say, are fluent in regulatory topics, if you like life sciences, financial institutions like banks and insurance companies and so on. So they have been living with regulations since forever. They tend to immediately go like, oh, new regulation, we have people that know about this stuff, and then they set up all compliance things and rules and structures that usually tend to shrink the opportunities down, right? Then you have on the other side, like, I think media company, like what I mentioned before, is the best example from those which are obviously under pressure now, because the whole business model is challenged, right? Like everything. However, they have hardly any experience with regulation, right? Like there's not much. They need a lot of support, so they are kind of blank on that regulatory piece, but they obviously need to establish something because they run the risk of running into all kinds of regulatory problems if they don't. But since it's new for them, that's their biggest pain point. They don't have so much a pain on how to use the technology because it's in most cases pretty obvious, right? And then you have the setup, you need to, like obviously you need some kind of executive, right? Like an ethics board or something. And you mentioned you need to define at some point the principles for the company, right? Where the company agrees on that these are the principles on responsible AI that they want to follow. Ideally that's published, because then they can be held accountable. If you just keep that in a secret box somewhere, then, well, you don't necessarily need to do anything. And you need processes, right? So you need, if you like, people, processes, and principles. And then you have what the people or the executive, so to speak, needs to adhere to, namely the principles, and you have the processes, which also make sure how that is done and also kind of makes it transparent to the rest of the company, maybe even externals, on how this company is handling their principles and how they're enforcing them, right? And then you get a setup that works. If you're lacking one or even two of those three, then it tends not to work. If you don't have the principles, individuals decide. That can be very blocking. If you don't have the processes, things kind of randomly go into directions. And obviously, if you don't have people, if you have principles and processes, nothing happens. So those three are pretty essential.
Is this something you agree with?
No, I completely agree. Yeah, I completely agree. Just picking up on one other point that Bjorn made, which I think is important, and that is the role of the broader public, of customers and employees and investors to all help to hold companies to account. And that plays to your point about transparency, publishing principles, explaining as a company what you're trying to do, makes it then easier for people to hold them to account. And if you don't, then people should be saying, well, why aren't you telling us what your principles are? What are you actually doing with our data? How are you using AI to impact us? And I think that's why general awareness is really important, so we get that strength of support for responsible AI.
So it needs more pressure, is that from getting more pressure on the private sector, sort of, so to say?
I think so. I mean, I think it's improving. I don't know if you both agree, but I think it's improving. I'm seeing a lot more companies proactively now asking for responsible AI consulting for assurance programs and compliance programs. I'd say it's night and day from 12 to 24 months ago in terms of the awareness on the part of companies. I think a big part of that's driven by the coming regulations, because they see laws are coming and they know they're going to have to do something. But I also think it's driven by what you see in the press about, examples of AI going wrong and bad headlines and so forth that make senior executives nervous.
But Mina, you seem skeptical about the point of more pressure being helpful at this point.
I mean, the reality looks a bit different. We read all the headlines in the media. You have Amazon using an internal recruiting software favoring male applicants over women. You then have a facial recognition software being published by IBM and Amazon, which has got a racial bias in its AI systems. We also saw it with ChatGPT even, with the responses that we obtained from it. So we still have a long way to go, and we need to tackle it, and it always fails also with a lack of awareness. If we want to start with education, then we need to tailor it to the needs of different target groups, that the executives know that this is also a business case for them, because if they don't view it as a business problem, then they won't do anything about it because it seems to be too altruistic or, some charity case, which is not the case. Then also for developers, product managers, and technologists, they have different teams, needs for their education. They need to understand, if I develop an AI model, I have bias recognition tools that help me to identify data biases throughout the development and testing phase. Or if I'm in UX and UI design, what does digital accessibility mean? And then, of course, I have all the employees within the organization, that they have some form of understanding on what is going on, where the debate is heading towards, and why it's important for their business.
You said that companies have to realize that it's sort of a business case, but intuitively, I would say if you have to comply with regulations to sort of implement responsible AI, then for me that doesn't sound like a business case, but more not contributing to value creation, but sort of hindering value creation, because there's more of a cost side behind it. You don't agree?
Well, it's so in the way you formulated it, right? It's a risk perspective. And there is a big business case because if you don't put that in place, you lose money, right? So you have your business case, which might look unusual because it's not about gaining money, but about not losing money, which at the end of the day is moving on the same direction on the scale, right? And the other thing is, as I said before, right, you can obviously have the option of not doing something, then you won't lose money, even if you don't do anything about responsible or ethics or whatever you might call it. So there you get your business case. If you want to use or leverage AI to generate some revenue or to generate any kind of impact, then you need that to make that actually work, right, to be responsible. So from that point of view, I would absolutely agree with what you said. That's part of, it's not maybe not on its own the business case, right, but it's an essential part of the business case.
I do think there's an opportunity, though, for some companies to really use responsible AI as a positive enhancement to their business. So one company that I was looking at recently is Writer.ai, and if you look at their proposition, the guardrails and the responsible AI controls that they have are a really key part of their client-facing proposition, and I hope we'll see more of that.
Yeah. I think we have some audience questions. I hate to interrupt the discussion at this point, but
just to add one remark, when you join any organization, you go through compliance training, which involves cybersecurity and data protection. And what I personally demand, also in my book, Fair Tech, that I published, is that the private sector will also have an AI ethics training for every employee who joins the organization, because it's the key to understand that we do not develop technology just for the purpose of economic advancement, but also for us as human beings in general.
Thank you. So we have lovely questions from our audience. First question, the responsible AI in practice means that the definition is clear to a developer who writes a new model code or makes an integration. What developers' artifacts or actions make AI responsible?
let's take it.
So if you go to GitHub, you will find a toolkit provided by IBM on trustworthy AI, which shows you how you can detect biases in your training data set during the feature engineering phase, and then also how you can design algorithms in a way that you do not have an over or under-representation of a specific attribute. I mean, it is always alarming when I have a training data set and then with the attribute gender, and I see proportionally more men represented compared to women, where we also talk about the gender data gap, then this is something that will signal me that I should get synthetic data, meaning data being generated with the help of artificial intelligence. So I can obtain that data from deep tech startups that are specialized in it. And of course, it needs to have the will by the developers who are here, that they use the tools available to them from the open source community, but then also synthetic training data to enrich it with the diverse representation of our society.
Thank you. Last question. How can I educate users to voice concerns about my AI services responsibility and transparency, especially when technical knowledge is required to understand these issues?
I think the key word is that the issues are not so easy, right? Like in there. So in there, it's really about education. And I mean, what we see a lot is like a lot of demand for education on the whole AI topics because it's complicated. And I think that's just one example of those. And I'm not sure about you, but we're running these education sessions across companies since probably 2 years, a lot more intense now, to resolve exactly these questions, to bring business people, let's say, closer to the technology, because it's not just about the responsible part or the trustworthy part or whatever, but also to understand everything else. And I'm pretty sure most developers have had this building on something and the business people didn't understand it, so there suddenly comes a lot of pressure. When they're educated before, and also the tech side is educated on how to communicate this, which is the other half of it, basically bringing both sides closer together, allowing them to, let's say, find a language they can both understand and communicate in on these topics, that tends to resolve not everything, but quite a lot of this.
Thank you for this panel. Thanks, everyone. We will be back in 10 minutes for scaling startups to success. Thank you.
Thank you.